Every empire has a throne built on blood, but no one in Varicor ever asked whose blood was spilling behind closed doors. The Alpha King they feared, the monster they whispered about in dark corners, was rotting from the inside out. And the only person keeping his heart beating was the same woman the entire kingdom wanted dead. This is a story about power, poison, and the brutal price of love in a world that devours the weak. Stay with me until the very end. If this story grips you, hit that like button and drop the name of the city where you are watching. Let me know where my pack is gathering tonight. The goblet slipped from Kyle Dravenheart's fingers and shattered against the stone floor, spraying dark wine across the fur pelt beneath his boots. He did not flinch. He stared at the crimson stain spreading outward like a wound opening in the earth and waited for his hand to stop shaking. It did not. 3 seconds. That was how long the tremor had lasted last month. Now it stretched past 10 and showed no sign of retreating. He clenched his fist against his thigh, pressing knuckles into muscle until the pain drowned out the weakness. Behind his ribs, something twisted. Not his heart. Deeper. The place where his wolf lived, the ancient beast that had once burned like a furnace at the center of his chest, now flickered like a candle drowning in its own wax. You broke another one. Seraphine stood in the doorway of his private chamber, arms crossed, silver hair catching the last threads of evening light slanting through the arched window. She was barefoot on the cold stone. She was always barefoot in their rooms, as though the palace floors were just another stretch of forest she had decided to claim. It slipped, Kale said. It slipped last week too, and the week before that. She crossed the room without hurry, the hem of her pale gown trailing behind her like smoke. She stopped in front of him and looked down at his hand. He had unclenched it, but the fingers still vibrated with a faint, involuntary rhythm. Let me see. It is nothing. Kyle. I said it is nothing. She caught his wrist. Her touch was cool, steady, and the instant her skin met his, the tremor died. Just like that. Like she had reached inside his blood and pressed a thumb against whatever nerve had gone haywire. His wolf stirred, not with strength, but with something closer to relief, the way a wounded animal goes still when it finally recognizes the hand that will not hurt it. He exhaled through his teeth. You cannot keep doing this. Doing what? Touching my own mate? She turned his hand over, studying the tendons, the scarred knuckles, the faint darkening beneath his nails that had appeared 3 months ago and never faded. Her jaw tightened. It is getting worse. I am aware. Then stop pretending you are not falling apart. She released his hand and stepped back, but not far. Never far. She had learned early in their bond that distance cost him more than pride was worth. The festival starts tomorrow. Every commander, every territorial lord, every scheming cousin with a claim to a scrap of power will be in this palace. You cannot shake through a toast in front of them. I will manage. You will manage, she repeated, flat. That is your answer for everything. You will manage while your wolf decays inside you. You will manage while your hands betray you in front of your enemies. You will manage right up until the moment you collapse on that throne and every predator in this empire tears each other apart, fighting over your corpse. The silence between them was not gentle. It never was. Seraphine did not offer comfort the way the court expected a Luna to, with soft hands and softer words and eyes that promised everything would be fine. She gave him the truth like a blade, edge first, and trusted him to catch it. What would you have me do? He said quietly. Let me examine you properly. Let me use the full bond. I can feel what is wrong if you stop blocking me out. The last time you opened the bond fully, you could not stand for 2 days. And you could hold a sword without your arm going numb. Seemed like a fair trade to me. He looked at her. Really looked. The shadows under her eyes that powder could not hide. The faint hollowness at her collarbones that had not been there a year ago. Whatever was killing him was feeding on her too, siphoning through the mate bond like a parasite that had learned to travel both directions. After the festival, he said, when the palace clears out, we will do it then. You keep pushing it back. Because every time you heal me, you pay for it with your own body, and I will not... Do not finish that sentence. Her voice went sharp enough to cut glass. Do not stand there, the most powerful alpha on this continent, and tell me you will not let me choose what I sacrifice. That is not protection. That is control wearing a prettier mask." He said nothing. She was right. She was almost always right, and it infuriated him in a way that also made him want to pull her closer and bury his face in her hair and admit how terrified he was. But Kael Dravenheart had been raised in a palace where terror was something you fed to other people. You never swallowed it yourself. "After the festival," he said again. Seraphine stared at him for a long moment, reading whatever she found in his expression the way a tracker reads broken branches and disturbed earth. Then she turned and walked to the window. "Your stepmother requested a private audience with me this morning." Every muscle in his back went rigid. "What did Morwen want?" "The usual. She wanted to remind me that Aluna's role is to stand beside the throne, not behind it. She said the council has concerns about my influence over you. She used the word unnatural 3 times in a single sentence, which I think might be a personal record for her." "What did you say?" "I told her that my influence over you consists primarily of convincing you to eat meals at regular intervals, and occasionally sleep, and that if the council finds that threatening, perhaps the council needs more demanding work." A faint smile crossed her face, there and gone. She did not find it amusing. Morwen does not find anything amusing that she did not orchestrate herself. "She is afraid of me, Kael." "She should be." "No, listen to me. She is not afraid of me the way she is afraid of your generals or your rivals. She is afraid of me the way people are afraid of things they do not understand. She looks at me and she sees something she cannot predict or purchase or poison, and that makes me the most dangerous thing in her world." He crossed to her then, standing close enough that the heat of his body pressed against her back. Through the window, the palace courtyard spread below them, already swarming with servants stringing lanterns and laying long tables for the festival of Crimson Flame. Banners bearing the Dravenheart crest, a black wolf devouring a crescent moon, snapped in the evening wind. "Morwen is a politician," Kael said. "She survives by making alliances and breaking them at the most profitable moment. She has been doing it since she married my father, and she will keep doing it until someone finally outmaneuvers her, but she will not touch you. Not while I breathe." Seraphine leaned back against his chest just slightly, and he felt his wolf settle like a beast finally allowed to rest. "That is exactly what worries me," she said softly. "The while you breathe part." The Festival of Crimson Flame had been a tradition in Varicor for 11 generations. Every territorial lord, every military commander, every bloodline with enough rank to merit an invitation descended upon the capital for 3 days of feasting, political theater, and the kind of smiling violence that empires ran on. Alliances were forged over wine, betrayals were planned over roasted boar. And the Alpha King sat at the center of it all, watching, measuring, deciding who was useful and who was a liability. Kael had always hated it. He stood at the head of the great hall, dressed in black armor polished to a mirror shine, the crown of Varicor heavy on his brow. Beside him, Seraphine wore silver, a gown that looked like liquid moonlight poured over her frame, and the court could not stop staring. They never could. She was not the kind of beautiful that made people comfortable. She was the kind that made them uneasy, the way a perfect blade is beautiful, the way a storm is beautiful when you are standing too close to the edge. "Smile," she murmured without moving her lips. "You look like you are about to execute someone." "The night is young." Commander Aldrich Voss approached first, as he always did, a mountain of a man with a scarred jaw and shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. He commanded the eastern garrison, 6,000 wolves, and his loyalty to Kael was the kind that came from shared blood on a battlefield, not from politics. "My king!" Aldrich dropped to one knee, fist over his heart. "The eastern border holds. The Grey March wolves tested our lines twice last month. We sent them home missing teeth." "Rise, Aldrich." Kael gripped the man's forearm and pulled him to his feet. "How many did we lose?" 7 wounded, none dead. Your Luna's healers made the difference. That field medicine protocol she established last winter saved at least 3 who would have bled out before the surgeons arrived. Kael glanced at Seraphine, who dipped her chin a fraction. She never took credit publicly. It was not modesty. It was strategy. A Luna who appeared too capable made certain people in the court very nervous. Walk with me later, Kael told Aldrich. There are things we need to discuss away from all these smiling faces. Aldrich's eyes flickered, reading the subtext. I will be wherever you need me, my king. The hall filled. Lords and ladies in silk and leather, commanders in dress armor, politicians in robes heavy with embroidered rank markers. The noise swelled, laughter and argument, and the clink of goblets, until the room felt like a living thing with its own pulse. Queen Mother Morwen arrived last, as she always did. She swept through the great doors in a gown of deep crimson, flanked by 2 members of her personal guard. Her hair was iron gray, pulled back in a severe arrangement that accentuated the sharp architecture of her face. She was not a large woman, but she occupied space the way a drawn bow occupies a room, all tension and potential energy, and the unspoken promise that something was about to be released. My beloved son. She stopped before the throne and inclined her head exactly as much as protocol demanded, and not 1 degree more. The festival looks magnificent. Your father would have been proud. My father had nothing to do with this festival, and you know it, Morwen. Must you always be so literal? I am paying you a compliment. You are performing. There is a difference. Morwen's smile did not waver. It never did. That smile was her finest weapon, a perfect mask that could absorb any blow and reflect back only what she wanted the world to see. She turned that smile on Seraphine. Luna, you look radiant. That gown is exquisite. Is it new? It is, Seraphine said evenly. Silver suits you, though some might say it is a bold choice. Silver is traditionally reserved for unbonded females in the old territories. But I suppose traditions are flexible things when one is young and confident. The insult was surgical, buried beneath 3 layers of pleasantry, and aimed directly at Seraphine's legitimacy as Kael's mate. Around them, at least a dozen courtiers caught it and exchanged glances. Seraphine tilted her head. I appreciate the history lesson, Queen Mother. Though, in my experience, the people most concerned with what others wear are usually the ones with the least interesting things to say. Something flickered behind Morwen's eyes. Not anger, calculation. She filed the response away like a general noting the position of enemy troops, then glided past them toward her place at the high table. Kael's hand found Seraphine's beneath the table as they took their seats. Her fingers were cold. She squeezed once, and he felt the message in it. I am fine. Stop worrying. Focus. But he could not focus, because 3 seats down from Morwen, someone he had not expected to see was filling a goblet with steady, deliberate hands. Tavern Dravenheart, Kael's younger half-brother, Morwen's son by blood, and the boy had grown in the year since Kael had last seen him. Broader through the chest, harder in the jaw, with his mother's calculating eyes set in a face that was dangerously close to handsome. He was 22, old enough to hold a commission, and the way he sat, straight-spined with his chin slightly elevated, suggested someone had been coaching him on how a king should carry himself. Kael caught Morwen watching him notice Tavrin. Her expression was perfectly neutral, which was how he knew it was deliberate. She brought him, Seraphine said, barely above a breath. I see that. She never brings him to court functions. He has been in the northern provinces for 2 years. I see that too. Kael, she is making a move. She is always making a move. That is what Morwen does. She does not breathe without calculating how the exhale serves her. He raised his goblet and drank, tasting nothing. Let her. Tonight we smile and watch. The feast raged for hours. Courses of venison and roasted root vegetables and honeyed bread gave way to darker wines and louder voices. Musicians played in the gallery above, their strings competing with the roar of conversation below. Kael moved through it all with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to perform power long before he understood what power actually cost. He clasped shoulders, traded barbs with territorial lords, accepted the loyalty oaths of minor commanders with a nod that managed to convey both gratitude and warning simultaneously. But beneath the performance, his wolf was screaming. Not loudly, not in the way that would make him lose control. It was more like a constant, low-frequency howl buried beneath his sternum, the sound of something dying slowly and fighting against the dying with everything it had left. He could feel the corruption spreading, that oily, cold presence that had been growing for years, threading through the connection between man and beast like black roots through clean soil. On bad nights, he could taste it, metallic and wrong, coating the back of his throat like swallowed copper. He had told no one except Seraphine. The Alpha King of Varicor could not be sick, could not be weakening, could not be anything less than the apex predator the Empire needed him to be, because the moment vulnerability showed, the wolves would not circle to protect him. They would circle to replace him. That was the lesson his father had taught him before Morwen had sunk her claws into the old king's mind and turned him into a puppet who smiled while his second wife dismantled everything he had built. Power is not a gift, boy. It is a territory. Stop defending it, and something hungrier will take it from you. Kyle excused himself from a conversation with Lord Heron of the Western Reach and stepped into a corridor off the main hall. The stone walls muffled the noise to a dull throb. He pressed his palm against the wall and breathed. "You look like death." Aldrich stood at the far end of the corridor, arms folded, his expression caught between concern and the professional blankness of a soldier who knew better than to show too much of either. "Flattering as always, Commander. I am serious. You have been gray under the skin all evening. The lords might not see it under the torchlight, but I have stood next to you in enough bad situations to know what you look like when you are running on empty." "I am fine." "You are lying, and you are bad at it, which is unusual for you." Aldrich moved closer, dropping his voice. "Whatever this is, Kyle, whatever you are carrying, let me help. I did not swear my life to a crown. I swore it to a man, and that man is not fine." For a fraction of a second, Kyle considered telling him everything. The poison he could feel in his veins, the way his wolf retreated deeper into his chest every week, as though burrowing away from something that hurt to touch. The way Seraphine's hand shook after she healed him, tremors she hid by clasping them behind her back, as though he had not memorized every gesture her body had ever made. But trust was a currency he could not afford to spend recklessly. Not tonight. Not with Morwen maneuvering and Tavern sitting in the great hall with a crown already forming behind his eyes. "After the festival," Kyle said, "you and I will talk. Properly. Not tonight." Aldrich studied him. "After the festival," he repeated, the way a man repeats a promise he is not sure the other person will live to keep. "Fine. But if you collapse in front of the court, I am dragging you out by the collar, and I do not care who sees." "Noted." They returned to the hall, and the night ground forward. It was past the second bell when Kyle noticed Seraphine was gone. He scanned the high table. Her chair was empty. Her goblet sat untouched. Morwen was engaged in animated conversation with a cluster of council members, her hands moving with the precise choreography of someone steering a discussion exactly where she wanted it to go. Tavern was drinking with a group of young officers who laughed too loudly at whatever he said, the kind of laughter that attached itself to proximity to power. Kyle caught the eye of Lyra, one of Seraphine's attendants, a sharp-featured woman with the watchful stillness of a predator resting between hunts. "Where is the Luna?" Lyra's expression shifted, something careful entering her eyes. "She stepped out perhaps 20 minutes ago, my king. She said the noise was giving her a headache. I believe she went toward the East Gallery." 20 minutes was too long. Kyle moved through the hall with purpose, but without urgency, because urgency attracted attention, and attention bred speculation, and speculation in a palace full of ambitious wolves was a weapon someone would inevitably pick up and use. He passed through the east corridor, past the tapestries depicting old conquests in thread and gold, past the guards who straightened as he approached, and relaxed only fractionally as he passed. The East Gallery was a long, open hall lined with arched windows overlooking the inner courtyard. Moonlight spilled across the stone floor in pale sheets. At the far end, a door stood ajar, opening into a smaller chamber used for private meetings and the kind of conversations that required no witnesses. The smell hit him first. Blood, fresh, warm, and heavy enough to coat the inside of his nostrils. Kyle's wolf surged forward, slamming against the walls of its cage with a force that cracked through his composure. His vision sharpened, colors draining to predator grays and silvers. His teeth ached as the shift pressed against the boundary of his control. He pushed through the door. Commander Aldrich Voss lay on the stone floor in a spreading lake of dark crimson. His throat had been opened from one side to the other, a single devastating wound that had severed everything that mattered. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with the blank surprise of a man who had not seen death coming. One hand was still half raised, frozen in a gesture that might have been defense or might have been reaching for something. Kneeling beside him, covered in blood from her forearms to her elbows, her silver gown drenched to a deep, wet red, was Seraphine. She looked up at Kael. Her eyes were wide, shocked, and her mouth opened but no sound came out. Her hands were pressed against Aldrich's throat as though she had been trying to hold the wound closed, as though she had reached him in time and found that time had already run out. Kael. Her voice was a ragged whisper. I found him. I heard something and I came in and he was already... Tried to stop the bleeding. I tried. Behind Kael, footsteps. Many of them, rapid and heavy. The noise of his departure had been noticed after all, or someone had timed this perfectly, because within seconds the corridor flooded with guards, courtiers, and then lords and commanders crowding the doorway, straining to see past the Alpha King and finding the worst possible scene waiting for them. A Luna soaked in the blood of the Empire's most loyal commander, a body still warm on the floor, and no other soul in the room. Lord Heron was the first to speak, his voice carrying the controlled outrage of a man who understood exactly how to weaponize a moment. Seize her! Nobody touches her! Kael's voice came out as something barely human, a sound from the bottom of a well, resonant with the authority of a wolf that had killed more threats than most of these men had ever faced. The room froze. Nobody moves until I say, My king! Counselor Draven pushed forward, his aged face arranged in an expression of grave concern that looked rehearsed even under these circumstances. The evidence is, I said nobody moves. Seraphine had not taken her hands from Aldrich's throat. Blood was pooling around her knees now, soaking through the silver fabric, turning it into something that looked like a flag of surrender dipped in war. He was still breathing when I got here, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. He looked at me. He tried to say something. Kael wanted to go to her. Every instinct in his body demanded it. The wolf howling to close the distance, to shield its mate, to stand between her and whatever was coming. But he could feel the room shifting around him like tectonic plates grinding against each other. He could feel the political calculus happening in real time behind every pair of eyes in that corridor. The Luna, the blood, the body. The story was already writing itself, and if he moved toward her now, if he showed anything other than the cold authority of a king dispensing justice, the story would consume them both. So he stood there, in the doorway, equidistant between his mate and his court, and he felt something inside him crack that had nothing to do with poison. Seal this room, he said. No one enters or leaves without my direct order. Commander Voss's body is not to be moved until my personal guard has examined every surface in this chamber. He turned to the corridor, to the faces crowding behind him, hungry for scandal, already composing the versions they would whisper to each other before dawn. Return to the hall, all of you, now. With respect, my king. Lord Heron had not moved. His voice was silk over steel. A member of your high command lies murdered. Your Luna stands covered in his blood. The laws of Varakor are clear. A suspect in a killing of this rank must be detained pending the judgment of the Alpha Council. No exception, not even for the crown. Kael stared at him. Heron stared back. And in that exchange of silence, Kael understood something with the clarity of a man watching a trap close around him from the inside. This was not a murder. This was an ambush. The body was real. The blood was real. The grief that would follow was real. But the architecture of this moment had been designed by someone who understood exactly what would happen when the most damning possible scene was placed in front of the most volatile possible audience. He looked back at Seraphine. She was still kneeling, still holding Aldrich's ruined throat as though letting go would mean admitting he was gone. Her eyes met his across the blood-soaked room, and he saw it in her face too. She knew. She understood what was happening to them, the machinery clanking into motion around them, and she was terrified. Not of the accusation, not of the blood on her hands. She was terrified of what it would cost him to save her. From somewhere in the crowd behind him, barely audible but timed with the precision of a blade slipped between ribs, Morwen's voice cut through the noise. The law must be upheld, even for those we love. Kael did not turn around. He did not need to see her face. He could hear the victory in her voice, quiet and patient and absolute, the sound of a woman who had waited years for exactly this moment and was savoring every second of its arrival. The guard stepped forward. Seraphine did not resist as they pulled her to her feet, her blood-soaked hands leaving Aldrich's body with a sound that Kael knew he would hear in his nightmares for as long as he lived. They flanked her, gripping her arms, and her silver hair fell across her face like a curtain drawing closed. "Kael," she said, just his name. Not pleading, not accusing, just a sound that carried everything they had ever been to each other, compressed into 2 syllables. He clenched his jaw so hard he tasted blood. His wolf slammed against his ribs, howling, clawing, demanding he tear apart every hand that dared to touch her. The corruption in his chest surged, cold and eager, and for one terrible second his vision went dark, and he felt the shift pushing forward with a violence that scared him more than anything else in the room. He forced it down. He forced all of it down. The wolf, the rage, the grief that was already gathering like storm clouds behind his eyes. He forced it down, and he stood perfectly still, and he let them take her, because the alternative was giving Morwen everything she wanted. The door closed behind Seraphine with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. The corridor emptied. The guards took their posts, and Kael Dravenhart, Alpha King of Veracor, stood alone in a room that smelled like the blood of his closest friend, and the end of everything he had been trying to hold together. His hand was shaking again. No one was there to stop it. The shaking stopped eventually. That was the worst part. Kael stood over Aldrich's body for a long time after the room emptied, long enough for the blood to stop spreading and begin to thicken at the edges, long enough for the torches to burn an inch lower, long enough for the silence to settle into something permanent. His hand steadied itself by degrees, and when it was finally still, he almost wished it had kept shaking. The tremor was honest. The stillness felt like surrender. He crouched beside Aldrich and looked at him the way he had looked at the dead on battlefields, direct and without flinching, because to look away was to say that death was something to be managed from a distance rather than witnessed up close. Aldrich Voss had deserved better than a stone floor and a political ambush dressed up as murder. He had been the kind of man who said exactly what he meant, who swore loyalty like he meant to keep it, who had dragged Kael out of a Grey March ambush 12 years ago with an arrow through his own shoulder and complained about the inconvenience the entire way back to camp. "I am sorry," Kael said quietly to the body. He did not say it often. He meant it now. He straightened, turned, and walked out of the chamber. The east corridor was empty except for 2 of his personal guard, Sen and Drav, who flanked the door with the rigid posture of men who had been told nothing and understood everything. Kael stopped in front of them. "No one enters that room," he said. "Not a servant, not a lord, not a council member, not the Queen Mother. If anyone tries, you put steel between them and that door. Clear?" "Clear, my king," Sen said. Kael walked. The palace at the 3rd bell was a different animal than the palace at midday. The banquet noise had faded to a low, conspiratorial murmur that spread through servants' corridors and side chambers like water finding cracks in stone. He could feel the story traveling ahead of him, passing from mouth to mouth, gathering weight and distortion with every telling. By morning, it would be unrecognizable. By morning, half the court would have Seraphine confessing over the body with a blade still in her hand, and the other half would be arguing about what crime she had been avenging, and all of them would be missing the point entirely. The holding chamber was in the east tower, 3 floors above the gallery, 2 guards outside. Standard protocol for a high-ranking detainee, which was what Seraphine was now, and the phrase sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He dismissed the guards with a look and opened the door himself. She was sitting on the narrow bench against the far wall, her back straight, her blood-stained hands folded in her lap. Someone had brought a basin of water that she had not used. Her silver gown had gone dark from waist to hem. She looked up when he entered, and he watched her do the thing she always did when she was frightened, that invisible internal adjustment, the straightening of something behind her eyes. "Lock the door," she said. He locked it. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, putting himself below her eye line, and she looked at him with the expression of someone trying to read a contract written in a language they mostly knew. "Tell me," he said. "I told you already." "Tell me again." She exhaled slowly. I stepped out because the heat in the hall was making my head swim. I walked the east gallery. I heard a sound from the side chamber, something heavy hitting the floor. I went in. Aldrich was on the ground. His throat was already open. There was nothing that could have saved him, but I tried to close the wound anyway because I did not know what else to do, and I could not just stand there and watch him die. She paused. And then you were in the doorway. Did you see anyone else? No. The window in that chamber was open. If someone went out that way, they could have reached the outer wall from the sill. It is not an easy drop, but it is possible. Did Aldrich say anything? Her jaw worked. One word, I think. His voice was almost gone. It sounded like Morwen, but I cannot be certain, and I will not swear to something I cannot be certain of. Cale held very still. The word landed in his gut like a coal, hot and small and radiating outward. He had known it was Morwen the moment he saw the scene, the staging of it, the timing, the way the corridor had filled with witnesses before he could even assess what he was looking at. But knowing and having were two different things, and right now he had nothing except a dying word from a dead man and a mate covered in blood. They are going to demand a council hearing, Seraphine said. Yes. They are going to argue that the bond between us compromises your judgment, that you cannot be a fair arbiter. Yes. They are going to remove you from the proceeding if they can, and if they cannot remove you, they are going to make everything you do look like the action of a man protecting his mate instead of a king protecting his empire. She looked at him steadily. Kael, how bad is this? He sat back on his heels. The cold honesty of her question deserved an equal answer. It is the worst possible configuration. Aldrich had no enemies that would move this quickly. He was universally respected, which means the court's grief is genuine, which means whoever is accused of killing him will face the full weight of collective outrage rather than political theater. The staging puts you at the center. There are no other witnesses. The bond makes my credibility suspect in any proceeding. He paused. It is very bad. She nodded once. That was Seraphine. She did not fall apart when he confirmed her fears. She filed the information and adjusted. Then we need to move faster than they expect. I need you to think. Anyone who would want Aldrich specifically dead, anyone who had access to that part of the palace tonight, any conversations you have had in the past weeks that seemed odd or misaligned. Morwen's aide, Seraphine said immediately. A man named Corvus. He came to me 3 weeks ago under the pretense of delivering a schedule change for a council meeting. He lingered. He asked about my healing practices, specifically whether I worked directly on the Alpha King's blood. I thought it was intrusive curiosity. Now I think it was inventory. Inventory. He was figuring out the mechanism, how my bond with you works, what it does to your body. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped lower. Kael, whoever did this needed Aldrich out of the way specifically. He was the one person in this palace you trusted completely enough to tell the truth to. If you had told him what was happening to you, if you had given him the evidence you have been gathering about the corruption in your wolf, he would have acted on it. He would have protected that information and protected you. Kael's mind moved through it like a hand moving through smoke, reaching for solid shapes. Morwen needed him gone before I could brief him, before I could ask him to investigate. She needed him gone before tonight, and this festival gave her the perfect audience for the second half. Kill Aldrich, plant Seraphine at the scene, force the Alpha Council's hand in front of every territorial lord and military commander in the Empire. She met his eyes. This is not just about framing me. This is about showing your court that you cannot protect even your own Luna, that you are weak enough to be outmaneuvered in your own palace. The wolf in his chest lurched forward, sudden and savage, and for a second the corruption surged with it, that cold black thing coiling around his lungs. His vision went briefly double. He pressed a hand to the stone floor to steady himself, and Seraphine's hand was on his arm before he had completed the gesture, her touch landing with the same instinctive accuracy it always had, the way a hawk lands on a familiar perch without looking. The cold thing retreated. Just barely. Just enough. You need to let me open the bond, she said, her voice low and absolutely flat. No room for argument in it. Not here. Not now. If you collapse during the council hearing, but I will not collapse. You almost just did, in a locked room with no witnesses. What happens when it hits you in front of Heron and Counselor Draven and every man Morwen has spent the last decade purchasing? He looked at her. The truthful answer was that it would end him, not in the dramatic sense, not immediately, but in the irreversible political sense. A king who could not hold his own body upright was a king whose throne was already someone else's. And then Morwen would have won without firing a second shot. "I will hold until morning," he said. "After the council convenes, I will find a way to get back to you." Her hand tightened on his arm. "I hate this. I know. I hate that she can do this. That she can move all of these pieces and you have to stand there and perform stability while your wolf is dying inside you. Seraphine. I hate that I found Aldrich and could not save him. I hate that my hands are covered in his blood and I cannot wash it off because if I wash it off tonight, it looks like I am destroying evidence." Her voice did not break, but it came close, the way a bridge comes close to collapsing without actually failing. "And I hate that I'm going to sit in this room being angry about all of it while you walk back out there alone." He reached up and covered her hand where it gripped his arm. Her fingers were cold, still faintly tacky with dried blood at the edges. He held them anyway. "In the morning, whatever they say in that council room, whatever protocol demands I appear to do, you need to know that I am not leaving you in this." "I know you are not. I need you to actually know it, not just tolerate it as a statement." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to count every scar on his face, long enough to find whatever she was looking for in his eyes. "I know it," she said, and this time it meant something different. He left her. He walked back through the east corridor, past Aldrich's sealed chamber, through the gallery and into the main passage that led toward the council wing. The palace was quieter now, but not asleep, lanterns burning in side rooms, the murmur of conversation audible behind closed doors. The court was processing, regrouping, choosing sides. His chief steward, Maret, was waiting for him at the council wing entrance, a reed-thin woman of 50 whose capacity for composure Kael had always relied on and occasionally resented. She fell into step beside him without preamble. "The Alpha Council has requested an emergency session at dawn," she said. "Lord Heron submitted the formal petition an hour ago. Councillor Draven co-signed. You have 7 members total petitioning, which is sufficient for a quorum." "Who held back?" "Councillor Eason and Lady Rovath declined to sign. Both are currently unavailable for comment." Which meant Morwen had already spoken to them, and they were either with her or frightened enough to stay neutral. Neither was useful to him. "What is the stated purpose of the session?" "Investigation into the death of Commander Voss and the status of the primary suspect." Maret paused half a step. "They used the phrase primary suspect, my king, in the formal documentation." He said nothing. Primary suspect was not an accusation, but it was not far from one, and in a council document it carried the weight of precedent. "There is something else," Maret said, and something in her tone sharpened his attention. "I conducted a quiet inquiry, as you have trained me to do in irregular situations. The side chamber where Commander Voss was found has a locked secondary access, a passage behind the east wall, a servant's route that was decommissioned during your father's renovation of that wing. The lock on it was old and would not appear tampered with to a casual examination, but the passage was used tonight." Kael stopped walking. "You are certain?" "There is disturbed dust in a pattern consistent with recent passage. I have not told anyone else." "Keep it that way. I want you to find out when that access was last opened. Check the maintenance records. I want to know who had a key and who would have known the passage existed. I will need access to the old steward records from your father's renovation period." "Get them." Maret nodded and peeled off down a side corridor without another word. Kael continued alone. The council wing opened into a broad anteroom where 2 figures waited, and he stopped short of the entrance when he recognized them. Councillor Draven stood with his hands behind his back in the posture of a man who had rehearsed his opening remarks. Beside him, at the edge of the lantern light, stood Tavern. Kael looked at his half-brother. Tavern looked back. In the years since Kael had last seen him, something had settled into the younger man's face that had not been there before. A weight, or the pretense of one. He was dressed simply compared to the festival, a plain shirt, dark trousers, no rank markers. Someone had advised him to look like a man of the people rather than a man of ambition. "Brother," Tavern said. "Half-brother," Kael said. Not cruelly, just accurately. Tavern absorbed the correction without visible reaction. "I am sorry about Aldrich. He was a good commander, better than good." "Yes, he was." Kael shifted his gaze to Draven. "Counselor, your petition was submitted without consulting me." Draven raised his chin. "The law does not require the Alpha's consultation for an emergency council petition, my king. It requires only a quorum of... I know what the law requires. I am noting the choice you made." Draven's mouth tightened. "Choices must be made when the situation demands them. Commander Voss's death demands a response the Empire can see, not a private investigation conducted by the Crown's own hand. And you believe the Empire cannot trust the Crown's hand. I believe that in matters where the Luna is implicated, the Crown's hand will naturally favor a particular outcome. The Council exists precisely to provide balance in such moments." Draven held his gaze with the practiced steadiness of a man who had survived 4 regime changes by never appearing to serve any of them. "We are not your enemies, my king. We are the institution that legitimizes your rule. If that institution is seen to act without independence, its legitimacy collapses. And then where are you?" There it was, the exact argument Morwen would have scripted if she had written it herself, wrapped in reasonable language and delivered by a face the court trusted. Kael looked at Draven and understood with the cold, absolute clarity of a man who had stopped lying to himself about how things worked that this counselor had been in her pocket for longer than tonight. "The session will convene at dawn," Kael said. "I will be present." The petition request I will be present, Counselor. You may note my attendance in the record however you choose." He stepped past them and then stopped, not turning around, his voice dropping to something quiet and final. "And you may also note that Aldrich Voss was my man. Whatever happens in that council room, whatever protocol requires of me, I will find who killed him. I will not stop looking, not for the council, not for the law, not for anything." He paused. "I thought you should know that before morning." He walked away. Behind him, he heard nothing. Not Draven, not Tavern. The silence of men recalculating. He did not return to his chamber. He went instead to the records room off the Eastern Archive, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of old parchment and tallow, and he worked alone through the last hours of the night, pulling files on the palace renovation, on Morwen's household accounts, on every appointment to every minor position that had been processed through the council in the past 3 years. He worked the way he had been trained to fight, with patience and without mercy, looking for the thread that would unravel the whole cloth. He found it just before dawn, not proof of anything yet, but a record, dry and administrative and devastating in its implications. A medical dispensation approved 18 months ago by the palace physician under Morwen's household seal. A compound of ingredients, each individually benign, approved under the cover of a routine tonic for strengthening the blood in aging wolves. The dispensation listed the dosage, the frequency, the expected duration of treatment. The expected duration was indefinite. Kael sat with the record in his hands and let the shape of the last 3 years reassemble itself around this single piece of paper. The progressive weakening he had attributed to the demands of the throne. The way his wolf had begun retreating inward, as though the beast itself was trying to protect some core of itself from contamination. The dependency on proximity to Seraphine that he had told himself was purely the mate bond deepening, not his own body failing without her healing presence to counteract something that had been introduced from outside. His hands were not shaking. There was nothing left to feel except the particular cold of a man who has found the answer and wishes he had not. The compound in the record was not a strength tonic. He knew enough of herbal chemistry, studied out of necessity rather than interest, to recognize 2 of the listed ingredients as components of a corruption accelerant, a substance that would not kill directly, but would systematically destabilize the bond between an alpha and his wolf over years, making the deterioration look natural, making it look like the slow defeat of a leader under the ordinary pressures of rule. Morwen had been poisoning him since 18 months ago at the absolute earliest, possibly longer. possibly since his father died, and she recognized that Kael was not going to be as manageable as the old king had become. He set the paper down. He thought about Seraphine in the East Tower, her blood-stained hands in her lap, her back straight because she did not allow herself to collapse. He thought about what her body had been doing every time she touched him, every time she opened the bond and let her healing run through their connection. She had been fighting a poison she did not know existed, using her own life force to counteract something deliberately introduced into the man she was bonded to, wearing herself thin over 18 months of invisible war. And now she was in a holding chamber, accused of murder, with a dawn council session closing around them both like a jaw. He stood. He gathered the document and 2 others that supported it, records that alone meant nothing but together formed the beginning of a chain. He folded them inside his shirt against his chest. He walked to the door. Outside the records room, in the pale gray light that preceded sunrise, Marae was waiting. Her expression was the most disturbed he had ever seen it, and in 15 years that was saying something significant. "Tell me," Kael said. "The decommissioned passage," Marae said. "I found the key records. There were 4 keys issued. 2 are in long-term storage and accounted for. 1 was listed as destroyed in the renovation records." She stopped. "And the 4th?" "The 4th was issued to the palace physician's office in the same administrative period as the renovation. The physician at that time retired 8 years ago. His successor inherited the office and all its contents." She looked at Kael with the expression of a woman delivering a verdict she wishes she could soften. "The current palace physician is Aldrich's second cousin. He has been in that position for 8 years. He had no motive to move against Aldrich, none that I can find." Another pause, shorter and heavier. "But 3 weeks ago, that physician was visited twice by the Queen Mother's aide, a man named Corvus. The name Seraphine had given him less than an hour ago." Kael stood in the gray pre-dawn corridor with the poison records against his chest and the threads of 18 months of systematic murder finally visible in his hands. And he understood with complete devastating certainty exactly what Morwen had built and how long she had been building it. The poisoning, the manufactured dependency, the framing, the council petition, tavern waiting in the wings, seasoned just enough, positioned just carefully enough. Every piece placed years in advance by a woman who had decided the empire's future long before its king had any idea a decision was being made. He had been dying by design, and his mate had been paying for the privilege of keeping him alive. He was still standing there, very still, when the council bell rang for the first time, 3 long tolls carrying through the palace walls like an announcement that the last door was swinging shut. The bell rang 3 times and then stopped, and the silence after it was worse than the sound. Kael moved, not toward the council chamber. Not yet. He went to the small washroom off the archive, poured cold water into the basin and put his face in it, held himself there until his lungs started objecting, then straightened and looked at the man in the bronze mirror. Gray under the eyes, a tightness at the jaw that came from holding too much for too long. The corruption in his chest had settled into a dull, persistent pressure, like a stone lodged somewhere it was never meant to go. And the absence of Seraphine's touch had left a particular kind of cold in his blood that he recognized now for what it was. Not loneliness, withdrawal. His body had been calibrated to her healing for 18 months without either of them knowing it, and every hour of distance was costing him incrementally. He dried his face and walked to the council chamber. The room was already full. 7 council members arranged in a horseshoe around the central floor, territorial lords permitted to observe from the raised gallery above, palace guards at every door, torches and the early gray light of dawn fighting each other through the high windows. The air smelled of candle smoke and ambition and the specific tension of men who had been talking for hours and had reached agreements they had not yet announced. Kael took his seat at the head of the horseshoe. He set nothing on the table. He said nothing. He simply sat, and he looked at each face in turn with the unhurried patience of a man deciding which trees to cut first in a forest he owns entirely. Lord Heron opened. "My king, the council thanks you for your attendance. Given the circumstances, we understand the personal difficulty." "Skip the courtesy," Kael said. "What are you here to say?" Heron's mouth closed and reopened. Beside him, Councillor Draven took over with the smoothness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this pivot. The Council has reviewed the available evidence in the matter of Commander Voss's death. The primary findings are as follows. The Luna was found at the scene. No other persons were identified. The physical evidence, meaning the blood and the positioning, is consistent with proximity during or immediately after the killing. The Luna has offered no credible alternative account of events, and no witness corroborates her stated version. She told me she heard a sound and went to investigate, Kael said. That is her account. That is an unverifiable account, my king. The Council is not in the business of taking unverifiable accounts on faith when a commander of Aldrich Voss's rank lies dead. Nor am I. Kael kept his voice level. Which is why I spent the night gathering verifiable information instead of sleeping. I have documents I would like entered into the Council record. A pause. Heron and Draven exchanged the briefest look, the kind that happened in the space between breaths and contained entire conversations. What documents? Draven said. Kael reached into his shirt and laid the folded papers on the table. A medical dispensation approved 18 months ago under the Queen Mother's household seal. A compound presented as a blood-strengthening tonic. The ingredient list, when read against basic herbal chemistry, describes a corruption accelerant, a substance designed to progressively destabilize the bond between an alpha and his wolf. He let that land. He watched it land. Someone has been administering this compound to me for at minimum 18 months, possibly longer. The gallery above was silent in the way that rooms go silent when everyone has stopped breathing simultaneously. Heron found his voice first. That is an extraordinary accusation. It is an extraordinary document. I did not write it. I found it in the palace records, filed under routine medical administration, which suggests either extraordinary carelessness or extraordinary confidence that no one would look. Even if this document is genuine, Draven said, and his voice had shifted to a register Kael recognized, the careful tone of a man navigating around a trap he had not expected. Its relevance to the matter before this council is unclear. We are here to address Commander Voss's death. We are here because someone wanted us here, Kael said. The question worth asking is not what this council will do about Seraphine. The question is why this council was convened at this precise moment before any independent investigation could occur, with a petition signed by 7 members before dawn. He looked at Draven directly. How did you have 7 signatures within an hour of the body being found, Counselor? Draven did not answer. The silence was damning in the specific way that silences are when the question was not rhetorical. My king. A new voice from the gallery. Kael looked up. Morwen stood at the gallery rail, composed and crimson, unhurried. She had not been there when he entered. She had entered quietly, as she always did, at the moment she calculated her entrance would have the most effect. These documents you produce in the middle of the night, without chain of custody, without verification, are being used to redirect this council from a clear and present matter to a conspiracy theory that conveniently implicates the very person this council might otherwise accuse. She let that settle. I understand the impulse. You love your mate, but an empire cannot afford to let love function as evidence. Every head in the room tracked between Morwen and Kael like spectators at a blade fight. Kael looked at his stepmother, and something in him went very quiet, the specific quietness that preceded the moment he had decided someone would die. Not yet. Not here. Enter the documents into the record, he said to the chamber secretary, a young man who had gone pale somewhere around the word accelerant and had not recovered since. All of them. The secretary entered them. Draven cleared his throat. Regardless of these documents, the council must address the immediate situation. The Luna remains the only identified suspect in the death of a high commander. Precedent and law both require formal proceedings. The council moves to recommend trial under the authority of the Alpha Council to be conducted during the Crimson Eclipse ceremony in 4 days' time before the assembled empire. He paused. The sentence, if guilty, to be carried out by the Alpha King personally, as law requires for crimes against the High Command. The words were a detonation with a long fuse. The meaning assembled itself piece by piece in the room. Trial, 4 days. Crimson Eclipse. Every territorial lord, every military commander, every citizen who had gathered for the festival. Seraphine judged before the largest possible audience. and if guilty, the blade in Kael's hand. Morwen had not simply framed Seraphine for murder. She had engineered a situation where the only legal outcome, if the evidence held, was Kael killing his own mate in front of the Empire. In one move, she would destroy Seraphine, shatter Kael from the inside out, unleash the corruption in his blood without the one thing keeping it in check, and do it all while the law stood behind her and applauded. Kael felt the wolf in his chest go absolutely still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of something past rage, in the territory on the other side where the body stops feeling and starts calculating. "Motion noted," he said. His voice came out flat and cold, stripped of everything except the shape of words. "We will reconvene this afternoon. This session is closed." He stood and walked out. He did not go to Seraphine. He could not yet. Not while the corridors would be watched and every movement observed and recorded. He went instead to the rooms of his chief archivist, a man named Pelin, who was 70 years old and had served 3 kings, and had the institutional memory of the palace stored behind his eyes, like water behind a dam. Pelin opened the door in his sleeping robe and took one look at Kael's face and stood aside without being asked. "The Crimson Eclipse ceremony," Kael said, as soon as the door was shut. "The execution protocol. Tell me every procedural detail." Pelin moved to his shelves with the slow certainty of a man who knew exactly where everything was. "The Crimson Eclipse execution protocol has not been invoked in 60 years. It was last used by your grandfather against a territorial lord who led an armed rebellion." He pulled a volume and set it on the reading table. "The law requires the Alpha King to personally deliver the sentence. The ceremony is conducted on the execution altar in the central courtyard, in full view of any gathered citizens and court members. The Alpha King strikes with the ceremonial blade, which is consecrated for the occasion. The sentence cannot be commuted once the public proclamation is made." He looked over his shoulder at Kael. "There is, however, one exception." Kael went still. "Say it." "The law was written in a period when alphas were sometimes called to sentence their own wolves. To prevent a king from being paralyzed by bond loyalty, an exception was built in. If new evidence of sufficient gravity is presented to the full council within 24 hours of the public proclamation, the execution is stayed pending review." Pelin's old eyes held something that might have been carefully managed hope. 24 hours. Not before the proclamation. After. How is sufficient gravity defined? It is not defined in the statute. It was left deliberately open. The council makes the determination. The same council that voted for the trial. Yes. So even the exception was a door Morwen had men standing behind. Kael closed the volume and sat down on the edge of Pelin's reading table in a way he would never have done in the palace itself, with the complete, unself-conscious exhaustion of a man letting his body do what his position usually would not permit. "Pelin, in 60 years of service, have you ever seen anything like what Morwen has built here?" The old man was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather had a chancellor who operated similarly. Long game, patient, everything designed to look like justice while serving a single interest." He paused. "That chancellor died of an apparent stomach ailment 3 months after your grandfather finally saw clearly. The historical record notes it as a tragic coincidence." Kael looked at him. The old man returned the look with perfect blandness. "Stay inside today," Kael said. "Lock your records." He left. The afternoon council session was worse than the morning. Maret had been busy in the intervening hours, and what she had assembled was a construction of evidence so carefully arranged it looked inevitable. Testimony from 2 junior guards who had seen Seraphine moving toward the East Gallery. A report from the palace physician, the same physician whose office had housed the 4th key, detailing what he described as anomalous lunar energy readings he had observed in Seraphine during a routine examination 6 months prior. The term forbidden lunar magic appeared in his written statement twice, and both times it hit the room like a brand pressed against skin. Forbidden lunar magic. The phrase had not been used officially in Varicor for 30 years. It invoked old fears, old wars, the generation of bloodshed that had followed the last Luna who had been accused of using her bond abilities to manipulate an alpha against his empire's interests. The history was brutal and specific, and Morwen had chosen it with surgical precision because it tapped a vein of collective fear that bypassed reason entirely. Kyle presented his counter-evidence. The decommissioned passage, Maret's findings about the key, and Corvus's visits to the physician, the timeline that placed the window of the murder too narrow for Seraphine to have inflicted the wound and then knelt at Aldrich's side. Draven questioned every piece. Heron questioned every piece. Two council members who had been silent all morning found their voices specifically to question the provenance of documents gathered by the Alpha King in the middle of the night without witnesses. The word convenient appeared 4 times in 90 minutes applied to Kael's evidence. The word forbidden appeared 6 times applied to Seraphine. Kael watched it happening. He watched the council, men he had governed with, men he had trusted with the machinery of the Empire, operating as a single instrument tuned to a single note. Not all of them compromised. Some were simply afraid. But fear and corruption produce identical votes, and the result was the same either way. By the 3rd bell of the afternoon, the public proclamation had been drafted. Kael sat with the document in front of him, the council seal already affixed, waiting for his signature. Around the table, 7 men in the watching gallery waited in the specific silence of people who have decided something and need the last formality completed before they can call it finished. The pen was in his hand. He thought about the records in his shirt. Not enough. Suggestive, damning in context, but not the kind of hard, irrefutable evidence that would survive a council challenge in the 24-hour window. He thought about Maret and Pelin and whatever Corvus had not yet been found to say. He thought about the decommissioned passage and the physician's statement and the careful architecture of 18 months of slow murder. He thought about Seraphine in the East Tower, saying, "I know it," in a voice that meant she trusted him with her life in the most literal possible sense. And he thought about the wolf in his chest, that flickering, corrupted thing, and what would happen to it the moment the bond broke. Not the slow deterioration of weeks, the instantaneous collapse of the one thing that had been counteracting the poison. Without the bond, without her proximity, the compound in his blood would have nothing opposing it. The corruption would have free run of everything it had been chewing at for 18 months. He would not survive a week. He signed the document. The pen left the parchment and the ink was wet, and every calculation he had made in the last 12 hours narrowed to this single irrevocable mark. He signed it because refusing to sign would give Morwen the justification she needed to invoke an emergency succession, and once succession proceedings began, Tavern would be on the throne before the ink dried on the refusal, and then Seraphine would face not a difficult council, but a hostile king with no obligation to any bond. He signed it because sometimes the only way to stay in the fight was to absorb the blow. He signed it and did not let his hand shake. Draven reached for the document immediately. Kael held it for one more second, which made Draven's hand stop short, and he looked at the counselor with an expression that Draven would later describe to no one because there was no language for what lived in it. Then he let it go. He was permitted to see Seraphine for 1 hour before the proclamation became public. A courtesy, the council called it. The courtesy felt like a blade, presented handle first by the person who intended to use it on you. He walked into the East Tower holding chamber, and she was standing this time, facing the door, which meant she had heard his footsteps and recognized them. Her gown had been replaced with a plain gray one, palace-issued, and her hair was loose and her face was clean and composed in the way faces are when a person has spent hours deciding what expression to wear when the person they love walks in with terrible news. He told her everything, the documents, the passage, the compound, the council vote, the proclamation. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was so quiet he could hear the torch in the wall bracket consuming itself. 4 days, she said. 4 days. And you signed it? Yes. She turned and walked to the window, which showed a narrow slice of courtyard and a strip of pale afternoon sky. Her back was straight. Her hands were at her sides. He watched her process it, watched the intelligence behind her face moving through the architecture of the situation the same way he had, reaching the same walls, finding the same locked doors. The exception clause, she said. The 24-hour window after the proclamation. Pelin found it, but the council controls the sufficiency determination, and Morwen controls enough of the council. Not all of it. Not all of it, he agreed. Isen and Rovath held back from the original petition. They were absent this afternoon, too. Which means she does not have them. They are not with her. They are waiting." Seraphine turned from the window and looked at him, and the fear was there, visible now in a way she was not trying to hide, but underneath it something harder and more deliberate. "If you can get to them before the proclamation becomes public, if you can show them enough, not the council majority, just those two, can they force a review alone? They need a minimum of 3 members to call for evidentiary review. With 2, I need a third who is not already committed against us. Lady Rovath will know who is genuinely uncommitted versus frightened. She has been reading this counsel longer than either of us has been alive." Seraphine's voice was steady, purely tactical now, the part of her that refused to let terror do the thinking. "Go to her tonight, before the public proclamation, before Morwen finishes sealing every exit. If I go to her and she turns me away, Morwen will know I am moving. She already knows you are moving. You entered evidence this morning and questioned the petition's timing in front of the full council. She has known since before dawn that you would fight this." Seraphine met his eyes and held them. "The question is not whether she knows. The question is whether you can move faster than she can close the doors." He crossed to her. Not carefully, not with the restrained approach of a man managing a difficult situation. He crossed to her in 3 steps and put his hands on either side of her face, and she put both of hers over his wrists, and they stood like that for a moment that had no politics in it. "I'm going to get you out of this," he said. "I know." "Say it like you believe it." A beat. The ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed her face, there and gone. "I believe it," she said. "I also believe you should leave before they time this visit and decide you have exceeded your courtesy. Go find Rovath. Do not let Morwen see you go." He left. He did not find Lady Rovath. Mare met him at the base of the East Tower stairs with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something past composure, something cracked open at the edges. She had a folded paper in her hand and she held it out to him without speaking, which was how he knew what was in it before he read a word. He unfolded it. A witness statement. Signed, sealed, time-stamped 2 hours ago. A servant named Breck, employed in the East Wing, who stated that on the night of Commander Voss's death, he had observed the Luna in the corridor outside the side chamber fully 20 minutes before the time she herself claimed to have heard a sound and entered. That she had appeared to be waiting, that she had spoken to no one and left in the direction of the chamber. It was a lie. A clean, precise, weaponized lie. The kind that could not simply be dismissed as mistaken because it was too specific, too time-stamped, too formally submitted. The kind that would close the council's evidentiary window before it opened, that would give Draven the justification to rule any new evidence insufficient in the face of direct eyewitness testimony. The kind that had been held in reserve and released at exactly the moment Kael had started making progress. Morwen had not been surprised by his evidence this morning. She had been noting which exits he found, and then she had sealed them. He stood in the stairwell with the false testimony in his hands and felt the last navigable path close like a door made of stone, soundless and absolute. He had 4 days. He had documents that the council would now contextualize against eyewitness testimony. He had 2 council members who were hiding. He had a mate who was going to be brought to the Crimson Eclipse altar in front of the Empire. And he had a wolf that was dying faster every hour she was not near him, a cold black thing spreading through the place where his strength used to live, eating the distance between who he had been and whatever he was becoming. Kael Dravenheart had governed this empire by the principles his father had taught him, by controlled strength and calculated mercy and the performance of certainty even when certainty was not there. He had been the Alpha King they needed, hard where the empire required hardness, steady where steadiness was the only thing holding the territories together. That version of him had just run out of legal moves. He folded the false testimony, placed it in his shirt alongside the real documents, and stood in the stairwell for exactly long enough to let the king he had been make peace with what came next. What came next did not look like rule of law. What came next did not look like council sessions and procedural maneuvering and evidence chains presented to men who had already decided. What came next looked like something that could not be taken back. He walked up the stairs instead of down, back toward the East Tower holding chamber, back toward the 2 guards he had posted who were loyal to him specifically and not to the institution around him. He was going to need them to look away. He was going to need Marais to remove 3 documents from the archive and ensure they existed nowhere in the palace records. He was going to need Pellin's institutional knowledge of every servant's passage, every forgotten door, every architectural seam in a building that was old enough to have bones no one remembered anymore. He was going to do something that a king could not do, which meant for the next 4 days, he was going to have to stop being one. He did not go back to the holding chamber that night. He sent Marais instead, with a message compressed to 7 words written on plain paper with no seal. Trust the plan. Do not break cover. Seraphine would understand. She would also hate it, which meant she would stay sharp and angry and focused rather than frightened, and right now frightened was a luxury neither of them could afford. Kael spent the night moving through the palace's forgotten skeleton. Pellin's knowledge of the building's old bones proved exact. Decommissioned servants' passages, bricked-over doorways that were brick on one side only, a drainage corridor beneath the east wing that ran close enough to the physician's office to matter. Kael moved through these spaces alone, without a torch after the first hour, navigating by memory and the kind of animal spatial awareness that came from spending his youth being chased through terrain that was always someone else's. His wolf, corrupted and guttering, still had enough left to read darkness and distance and the faint body heat signatures of guards on the other side of walls. He reached the physician's office at the second bell. The physician, a thin man named Castor, who had the sunken look of someone who had not slept honestly in weeks, woke to find the Alpha King sitting in the chair across from his bed. Castor opened his mouth. Kael put one finger to his lips. The conversation that followed was quiet and extremely short. Castor gave him the compound. The original stock, a small ceramic vial with a wax seal, enough left to submit for independent analysis by anyone who knew what they were looking at. He gave Kael the dispensation records he had been keeping, the real ones, not the sanitized versions submitted to the council archive. He gave him the name of the apothecary in the lower city who had sourced the ingredients on Morwen's order, a man who had apparently retained his own copy of that commission out of the specific self-preservation instinct of someone who understood they were handling something that could one day be turned against them. He gave Kael all of it, with the trembling compliance of a man who had made a bad calculation 18 months ago and had been waiting ever since for the moment when someone with enough power finally came to collect. Corvus threatened your family, Kael said. Not a question. My daughter, Castor said. She lives in the 3rd district. She is 9 years old. She is under palace protection as of this moment. Write that down and show her if you need to. My personal seal. Castor stared at the seal impression Kael pressed into the soft wax of a candle stub and looked like a man watching a door open that he had stopped believing was real. Kael left the way he had come. By dawn, he had the apothecary's commission document. By mid-morning, through Marais operating in the specific capacity of a woman who had spent 15 years learning which servant saw everything and told nothing in exchange for small dignities, he had 2 additional witness statements. A kitchen worker who had seen Corvus leaving the East Wing on the night of the festival. A stable hand who had observed a hooded figure, slight-framed, entering through the outer gate at an hour inconsistent with any logged staff movement. Not Morwen herself. She was too careful for that. But a chain. A chain with enough links now that pulling any one of them would eventually reach her hand. He went to Lady Rovath. She lived in the palace's south-facing guest apartments, as she had for 20 years. A woman of 70 with the compact stillness of someone who had outlasted 4 political upheavals by the simple discipline of never committing publicly before she had committed privately. She received him in her sitting room, dressed and alert, which told him she had been expecting this visit. You have new evidence, she said, before he sat. Enough. Show me. He showed her. She read without commentary, without visible reaction, her expression the closed, professional neutrality of a person assessing something that will require them to act in ways they would prefer not to. When she finished, she set the papers on her knee and looked at the window for a long moment. If I support a review petition, Morwen will move against me. Yes. She has material on me, nothing criminal, but sufficient to damage my standing with the territorial lords I rely on. I know. You know. She looked at him. And you are asking anyway. I am asking because you are one of 2 people in this palace who have not been purchased, and because you have sat in that council chamber for 20 years, watching men make decisions they knew were wrong because the alternative cost them something personal, and I think you are tired of it." He held her gaze. "I think you have been waiting for a moment where it was worth the cost." Rovath was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that had texture and weight, the quiet of a person setting something down they have been carrying for a long time and deciding whether to pick it up again. "Counselor Eason will follow my lead if I move first," she said finally. "He has no spine for originality, but considerable courage for solidarity. That gives you 3. She paused. "It gives you a review. It does not give you a verdict." "A review is all I need. I will handle the verdict." She looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but lived in the territory between. "You look terrible, my king." "I am aware." "Whatever she has been giving you, the compound." Her eyes dropped briefly to his hands, and he realized the tremor was visible even here, even at rest, a fine vibration he could no longer fully suppress. "How long do you have before it becomes acute?" He did not answer. She did not push. She folded the documents and held them against her chest. "I will submit the petition before the second bell," she said. "You have your review window." The Crimson Eclipse ceremony began at dusk on the 4th day. The central courtyard of Varakor's palace could hold 4,000 people, and on this evening it held all of them and more. Word had spread through the capital the way fire spreads through dry grass, not with announcement, but with the particular momentum of a story that people believe is true before they have verified a single detail. The Luna, the blood, the forbidden magic, the Alpha King forced to act against his own bond, the Empire's grief for Aldrich Voss compressed and redirected into the cleaner shape of anger. Kale stood at the top of the execution altar stairs and looked out at the crowd and thought that a ruler who governs by fear has to keep feeding that fear, or it turns and looks for something closer to eat. His father had known this. Morwen had built her entire architecture of control around it. The crowd below was not evil, it was afraid, and fear was just hunger wearing a different face. The ceremonial blade was in his hand. It was heavier than he remembered, though he had lifted heavier things. The weight was not physical. Seraphine was brought out from the side entrance flanked by 4 guards. She was dressed in white, palace-issued, the traditional color for this ceremony, and her silver hair was loose, and her chin was level, and she walked with the deliberate steadiness of a person who has decided exactly how they will move through the worst moment of their life. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at him. He looked back. The corruption in his chest had advanced overnight in ways he had not told anyone about. His vision had been intermittently doubling since dawn. There was a sound at the edge of his hearing, low and constant, that he suspected was his wolf beginning to vocalize its distress in a frequency only he could feel. The bond between them, stretched thin by 4 days of near-total separation, felt like a wire pulled past its tensile limit, still intact but vibrating with the specific tension of something that understood it was close to breaking. Counselor Draven stepped forward to read the formal proclamation. Kyle let him read. Every word of it. The charges, the evidence summary, the council's determination. He stood still on the altar platform and let the words fall into the courtyard and watched the crowd's face shift and contract with them. Seraphine reached the altar steps. The guards stopped. Protocol required her to climb alone. She climbed. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the exact shade of her eyes, and the fine tension in her jaw and the place at her throat where her pulse beat, rapid but steady, steady in the way she chose everything. "Kyle," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. "I know," he said. "Whatever happens, I would choose this. I would choose you in every version of this." Something in his chest cracked so cleanly it was almost structural. He tightened his grip on the blade. Draven finished the proclamation. The courtyard went silent in the way that large crowds go silent. Not the absence of sound, but the compression of it, 4,000 people holding the same breath. "The Alpha King will now carry out the sentence," Draven announced. Kale raised the blade. In the gallery above the courtyard's east wall, Roveth moved. The petition document was in Draven's hands before Kale completed the motion. passed by a runner who had been positioned for exactly this moment, and Rovath's voice cut across the courtyard with the carrying force of a woman who had spent 20 years learning how to be heard in rooms full of men who did not want to hear her. The Alpha Council calls a formal stay of execution pending evidentiary review. Submitted under the signatures of Councillor Rovath, Councillor Eason, and Lord Heron. The last name hit the courtyard like a stone hitting water. Heron. Kael did not move. He held the blade in the raised position and kept his face locked and processed the information with the part of his mind that had been running contingencies for 4 days. Heron had not been in Rovath's apartment. Heron had been one of the first to demand Seraphine's detention. Heron had co-signed the original petition. Something had changed Heron's position in the last 24 hours, and Kael had not been the one to change it. He looked at Morwen. She was standing in the gallery opposite Rovath, and for the first time in the entire 4 days, the mask was wrong. Not gone, not broken, just microscopically, fatally wrong, a displacement of composure so small that only someone who had spent years studying that face would catch it. Something had surprised her. Something had moved without her directing it. Draven was reading the petition. The crowd's held breath broke apart into noise, chaotic and directionless. The sound of 4,000 people losing the narrative they had come prepared to witness. Kael lowered the blade. "The execution is stayed," he said, loud enough to reach the back wall. "Pending review." The noise doubled. Seraphine let out one breath. He caught it, felt it through the stretched wire of their bond, and the wolf in his chest lurched toward her with an urgency that almost buckled his knees. He stood straight. He was still the Alpha King on a public altar, and the next 30 seconds would determine whether the stay held or dissolved, and he could not afford to show a single crack. "My king!" Draven's voice was controlled fury compressed into 2 words. He climbed the altar steps, which was a breach of protocol, and his face was the face of a man whose plan had just sustained a wound he had not anticipated. "The petition is irregular. Heron's signature requires verification." "The petition requires 3 council members in good standing," Kael said. "You have 3. The signatures will be verified in the review session, as procedure requires. Is there a procedural objection you would like to make on the public record, Counselor, or would you prefer to make it in the chamber?" Draven stopped. His jaw worked. He was calculating, the way men calculate when a move they expected to work has not worked, running through what it means and what comes next and whether the asset is still viable. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the gallery where Morwen stood with her almost wrong face. He stepped back down the stairs. Kael turned to the guards flanking the altar. "Return the Luna to comfortable quarters, not the holding chamber, my private receiving rooms. Post my personal guard." "My king, the council protocol requires—" "I know what it requires." He looked at the guard who had spoken, a young man who was following orders from someone other than Kael, which he could tell by the slight resistance in the voice. "I am giving you a direct order. Carry it out." The guard carried it out. Seraphine passed close enough to him on the way down the stairs that he could have reached out and touched her. He did not, because the courtyard was still full and watching, but she turned her head just slightly as she passed, and he felt the bond flare between them, warm and electric, and alive in a way it had not been in 4 days. And the corruption in his chest recoiled from it like something biological recognizing its opposite. He descended the altar. He walked through the crowd that parted for him with the specific automatic deference of people who had not yet decided whether they were afraid or outraged or relieved. He walked through the courtyard gates and into the passage that led toward the main corridor, and he was 20 feet from the council wing entrance when the hand closed around his arm from a side doorway. He spun, had the person against the wall with a forearm across their throat before his eyes had registered the face. Tavern. Breathing hard, his collar disordered like a man who had been moving fast and badly, his expression nothing like the cultivated composure of the young man at the festival. He looked genuinely frightened. "Let me go," Tavern said. "I need to talk to you." Kael held him for 1 second longer than necessary, then stepped back. "Talk." "Heron!" Tavern straightened his collar with a sharp, nervous motion. "He came to me last night. He told me that Morwen had promised him the Eastern Garrison Command once I took the throne. He came to me because he wanted to confirm the arrangement directly. His jaw tightened. I am not taking the throne. I told him so. I told him I had not agreed to any arrangement with Morwen and that his commission under any succession she orchestrated was worth nothing. Kael studied his half-brother. The shape of the man under the politics of him. He looked like their father in the bone structure, something Kael had always been aware of and never found useful until this moment, because it meant he could read the tells. The old king had been incapable of sustained dishonesty in private company, something Morwen had eventually corrected for in public situations, but never managed to eliminate in one-on-one exchanges. Tavern had the same tell, the slight forward pressure of the shoulders when he was telling the truth about something that cost him. Why? Kael said. Because she killed Aldrich. I knew him. He trained the northern garrison when I was posted there. He was the best man in this palace, and she had him murdered so she could use his body as furniture in her game. Tavern's voice went flat in the way voices go flat when anger has burned past the point of expression. I did not agree to be part of that. I did not agree to any of this. You were positioned for it. I was positioned by her. There is a difference. His eyes were direct, and again, the shoulders. I am not your enemy, Kael. I have never been your enemy. I am 22 years old and I want a commission in the Northern Territories and a life that my mother does not own. A pause. That is all I have ever wanted. Kael exhaled slowly through his nose. Trust was a weapon in this palace, and handing it out was the fastest way to bleed. But Heron's signature on that petition had not appeared from nowhere, and if Tavern had turned the commander's loyalty in the last 24 hours, he had materially changed the outcome of this day. Heron is yours? Kael said. He is yours. I just redirected him. And Morwen does not know. Not yet. She will figure it out in the next few hours. Which meant hours were all they had before she moved to the contingency Kael had been assuming she was holding in reserve. Every strategist held something in reserve. Morwen had been operating at this level for 30 years, and she had not gotten this far by spending all her pieces before the endgame. Stay close, Kael said. Not visible. If she moves against you, she has tried before. Something in Tavern's face hardened briefly, and Kael saw in that moment the shape of what the younger man had been living inside for the last several years, the proximity to a parent who treated family as a resource to be managed. I know how to stay out of her reach when I need to. They separated. Kael reached the council wing and moved fast now, the careful pace abandoned because the careful pace had served its purpose. In the receiving rooms, Seraphine was standing at the center of the floor, and the moment he entered and closed the door, she crossed the room and put both hands on his chest and opened the bond fully without asking. It hit him like a wall of heat after a sustained winter. His wolf surged upward with a sound that was almost audible, that pressure behind his sternum releasing in a wave that ran the full length of his spine and out through his limbs. The corruption recoiled, burning at the edges where her healing met it, and the vision doubling snapped back to clean single focus, and the tremor in his hand stopped so suddenly it felt like a severed string. He gripped her arms. She had gone pale, the color draining from her face as it always did when the full bond ran both directions, as the compound in his blood found the path of her healing and pushed back against it. Seraphine. I am fine. Through her teeth, not fine. Present. You do not have to. The compound has been in you for 18 months, and you have been away from me for 4 days. Her voice was strained but precise, the voice of someone maintaining language under physical pressure. If I do not push it back now, you will not be standing in an hour. Stop arguing. He stopped arguing. He held her arms and let it happen and felt the corruption contracting, retreating from the edges outward. And underneath the cold and the rot, the wolf gathered itself, still weakened, still damaged, but recognizable. His. The thing Morwen had been trying to kill by degrees since the day she decided he was more useful dying than alive. Seraphine lowered her hands after 2 minutes and leaned her forehead against his shoulder, breathing carefully. Her pulse was racing. He could feel it through the bond, rapid and shallow, the cost of what she had just done with it written plainly in her body. The review session, she said. When? Tomorrow morning. Rovath is convening it before Morwen can challenge the petition on procedural grounds. We have until dawn to prepare everything. He pulled back and looked at her face, the pallor and the shadows and the absolute refusal in her eyes to acknowledge either. The apothecary's commission, Castor's records, 2 witnesses. Heron, is it enough? It needs to be. She straightened away from him, and he watched her rebuild the composure she used when she needed to be strategic rather than human, that particular internal architecture she had developed for navigating a palace that had been hostile to her since the first day she arrived in it. Then we build the case tonight. There is one more thing. He held her gaze. Corvus has not been found. Morwen still has something in reserve. I can feel it the way you can feel pressure before a storm breaks. She has not used everything, which means tomorrow, regardless of the evidence, regardless of Rovath and Heron, and every document I lay on that table, she will have one more move. Seraphine looked at him steadily. Then we will need to be ready for something we cannot predict. How do you prepare for something you cannot predict? She held his gaze for a long moment, and the answer, when it came, was not tactical or procedural. It was the answer of someone who had spent years surviving a situation that should have destroyed them long before it reached this point. You stop trying to predict it. You make yourself the thing she cannot prepare for instead. Outside the receiving room, the palace settled into its night sounds, and somewhere in the south wing, Kael knew without having to check, Morwen was already moving her last pieces. He could not see what they were yet. He could only feel the shape of them approaching in the dark, the way you feel a blade before it arrives, in the cold that runs ahead of the steel. He had until dawn to become something she had not accounted for. He started working. They worked through the night. Moritz spread the documents across the receiving room floor in the order a fair arbiter would need to encounter them, not the order that was most dramatic, but the order that built understanding incrementally, each piece landing before the next asked for a larger leap. Castor's original dispensation records, the apothecary's commission with Morwen's household seal, the decommissioned passage key history, the 2 witness statements, Corvus's visits to the physician's office, time-stamped and cross-referenced against the festival schedule, Heron's written withdrawal from the original petition, which he had submitted to Rovath before midnight with the particular completeness of a man who understood he was burning something down and wanted the fire to be thorough. Seraphine sat on the floor in the middle of it and read everything twice. She had the capacity for this kind of work that Kael had always found quietly astonishing. The ability to read a stack of dry administrative documents and see the human machinery inside them, to trace which hand had moved which piece and why, to feel the emotional logic underneath the procedural language. She had grown up in a minor territory where survival required reading the room before the room knew you were in it. That skill, refined by years in a palace that had never accepted her, had become something close to a sixth sense. The apothecary, she said, setting down the commission document. He retained his copy because he was afraid, which means he has been afraid for 18 months, which means he has been living inside the knowledge of what he participated in and waiting for the weight of it to land on him. He will testify, Kael said. I gave him a reason to. You gave him protection. That is not the same as a reason. She looked up at him. The reason he will testify is because he has been carrying this alone and it has been destroying him. People do not hold evidence this long unless they intend to use it eventually. He was waiting for someone to make it survivable. Kael crouched down beside the document spread. His wolf was quieter than it had been in days, still damaged, still bearing the marks of 18 months of systematic poisoning, but present, recognizable. The corruption had retreated to a manageable burn rather than the spreading cold that had been colonizing his chest since the festival. He could feel the wolf's awareness moving through the bond, cautious and animal, the way a badly injured creature moves when it begins to believe the worst might be over. He did not let himself believe that yet. What is she holding back? He said. Not a question. Thinking out loud. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Something that does not require preparation time, she said slowly. Everything she has done in this sequence required setup. The compound, the passage, the false testimony, the petition signatures, weeks or months of placement. Whatever she has left, it is something she can deploy in the moment, something that responds to circumstances rather than creating them. A person, Kael said. Seraphine met his eyes. Someone inside the review session itself. They looked at each other across the document spread and the torchlight and the particular silence of two people who have been through enough together that whole conversations happen in the space between sentences. Draven, Kael said. He chairs the review by default. His position gives him procedural authority over what evidence is admitted and what is challenged. She paused. If he rules the apothecary's document inadmissible on chain of custody grounds, if he disqualifies Castor's testimony on the basis that a compromised physician cannot be a credible witness against the person who compromised him, the entire chain collapses before the council even deliberates. Can he do that legally? The procedural statutes give the chair significant latitude in evidentiary determinations during review sessions. Pellin confirmed it. It was written that way intentionally, to allow fast decisions in crisis situations. She set her hands on her knees. He can gut the case in the first 20 minutes if he chooses to. Kael stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark courtyard. Empty now. The altar still standing in the center of it like an accusation that had not yet finished being made. The ceremonial blade would have been returned to its case. By tomorrow evening, it would be back in his hands or it would not. And the difference between those two outcomes was a procedural decision made by a man who had been bought with a garrison command that no longer existed because Tavern had refused to honor it. The shape of Morwen's last move resolved in his mind with the slow clarity of something that had been there all along, waiting for him to stop looking past it. She does not need Draven to win the session, he said. She needs him to delay it long enough. Seraphine's breath changed. He heard it. Long enough for what? She said, though her voice already knew. Long enough for the compound to finish what it started. He turned from the window. She has seen me. She has watched me these past 4 days. She knows the bond has been stretched to its limit. She knows what that does to the corruption's progression. If the session runs long, if Draven ties it up in procedural challenges through the morning and into the afternoon, she does not need a ruling, she just needs time. The room was very quiet. He watched Seraphine process it, watched her reach the same endpoint he had reached and hold it. The knowledge that the most dangerous thing in the room tomorrow was not false testimony or procedural maneuvering, but the simple passage of hours. Then we cannot let it run long, she said. We go in with everything visible and force a fast determination. No extended arguments. Every document already in the official record before the session opens, so Draven cannot rule on admission during the session itself. Rovath controls the submission process, not Draven. She is the petitioning council member. Can she pre-file? Kael looked at Maret, who had been standing at the edge of the room with the stillness of a woman who had trained herself not to exist in situations where existing was inconvenient. Maret's expression sharpened. The petition rules allow the submitting member to attach supporting documents at filing, Maret said. If Lady Rovath amends her petition before the session opens to include all evidentiary materials, those materials enter the record at filing and the chair's admission authority does not apply. How long does she have to amend? The session is called for the second bell. She can amend until the first bell. Seraphine was already moving toward the writing desk. Kael watched her draft the amendment instructions for Rovath, her handwriting fast and precise, the pen moving without hesitation. He thought about the first time he had watched her work like this, in a different room, in a different crisis, 3 years ago when a territorial dispute had threatened to pull 2 eastern provinces into open conflict and she had spent 18 hours reading correspondence from both sides and had produced a settlement proposal that neither lord could argue with because it was too accurate about both of them. He had watched her that night and understood something he had not expected to understand about what it meant to share power with someone rather than simply exercising it. He had not been good at applying that understanding. He had been better at it than his father had been, which was not a high bar. He had tried. He had failed in the specific ways that men who are trained from birth to treat authority as a personal attribute fail, by pulling decisions back to himself when they frightened him, by conflating her safety with her containment, by signing a proclamation he should have found a third way around rather than a different way through. He would not run out of time to do better. He was going to make certain of that. He crossed to the desk and put his hand over hers on the parchment. She stopped writing. She looked up at him, and he saw in her face the exhaustion she had been managing since the festival. genuine and deep, the exhaustion of someone who had been healing a wound they did not know the source of for 18 months, while simultaneously navigating a palace that treated their presence as a threat. "After this is finished," he said. "After," she agreed. "I mean it. After this, we talk about all of it. What I did wrong. What I kept from you. The proclamation." He held her gaze. "I will not ask you to absorb it without an accounting." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know you will not." She turned back to the parchment. "But right now I need to finish this. Let me finish this." He let her finish it. The review session opened at the second bell in a council chamber that felt smaller than its dimensions because of how many bodies were in it. Every council member present, territorial lords in the gallery, palace staff pressed against the back wall, which was not protocol, but which Kael had permitted because transparency in this room today was not a vulnerability, but an armor. Morwen arrived and took a gallery seat above and to the right. She was in deep green today, a departure from her usual crimson that Kyle read as deliberate. She was presenting herself as measured rather than triumphant, patient, a woman present to observe justice rather than direct it. Rovath stood and submitted the amended petition, every document attached, every witness statement embedded in the filing record. Draven's expression as the chamber secretary confirmed the pre-filing did not change, which was how Kyle knew the option had not occurred to him, and he was recalculating. The session began. Castor testified first. He was pale and he trembled once in the opening minutes, and then stopped trembling, the way people stop trembling when they have gone past the fear into the thing on the other side of it, which is not courage so much as the relief of finally saying out loud what has been living in silence inside you. He described the dispensation, the compound's actual properties, the 18 months of administration, Corvus's visits. He did not look at Morwen's gallery once. The apothecary testified by written statement, which Rovath read into the record with the flat, caring voice of a woman who had been waiting 20 years to read something like this out loud in this room. Mare presented the key records, the passage evidence, the timeline. Draven challenged twice on procedural grounds, and Rovath overruled him twice on the basis of pre-filed admission, which he could not counter without challenging his own counsel's filing rules, and he was not prepared to do that in a room full of witnesses. Heron spoke. He was brief and he was hard, and he looked at the chamber rather than at Morwen and said that he had been led to believe certain arrangements had been made on behalf of a succession that he had not fully understood was being manufactured rather than anticipated. He said the word manufactured with the deliberate weight of a man who has chosen his vocabulary with care. It took 3 hours. Not the full day Morwen had needed. Kale felt it in his wolf when the deliberation broke. The moment the chamber shifted from contested to decided was physically perceptible to him. A change in the air pressure of the room, the specific release of tension that happens when a group of people who have been arguing reach the side of an argument that was always going to be the true one. He had felt this before, on battlefields when the line finally broke. The moment itself was quiet. The aftermath was not. Counselor Eason called the determination. The charges against Seraphine were formally withdrawn. The evidence of the compound was referred to the full council for investigation into the source and administration. Corvus's name was entered into the official arrest record. Draven did not vote. He sat through the final determination with the expression of a man watching a structure he built with significant personal investment collapse from a foundation fault he had overlooked, and then he gathered his documents and walked out before the session formally closed. No one stopped him. The time for stopping Draven was later, when the shape of his participation had been fully mapped. Today, he was allowed to leave because his departure was itself a kind of testimony. Kael was still seated at the head of the table when the chamber emptied to a handful. Seraphine was beside him. She had been permitted to attend the session as a witness in her own proceeding, a procedural accommodation Rovath had inserted into the amended petition with the specific foresight of someone who understood the symbolic value of presence. When the last council member filed out, Seraphine put her hand on the table between them, palm up. He put his over it. They sat like that for a moment that had no language in it. Then Kael stood and walked to the gallery stairs. Morwen was still there. She was the only person remaining in the gallery, seated exactly where she had been at the session's opening, her posture undisturbed, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of a woman who had decided on a particular presentation and intended to maintain it regardless of circumstance. She watched him climb the stairs without moving. When he reached the top and stopped in front of her, she tilted her head back to look at him with the specific expression she had always used when addressing him, the expression that said she was humoring him, that whatever he said next would be received as the limited perspective of someone who did not understand the full picture. He had spent 20 years making decisions around that expression, trying to prove something to a face that had decided before he opened his mouth. He was done with that. "Morwen," he said. "My son." Her voice was even. "I assume you feel vindicated." "I feel very little at the moment." He crouched down to put himself at her eye level, because he was not going to stand over her for this. That was not what this was. "I want to ask you something directly." She waited. "My father," at the end, when he could not hold a thought from one morning to the next, and the council was running on your direction, and the territories were answering to your correspondence rather than his. Did you believe you were helping him, or had you stopped thinking about him at all? Something moved in her face, subtle and deep and gone quickly. "That is a strange question. It is the only one I actually want an answer to." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had shifted by a fraction, the performance quality reduced, the thing underneath it more visible. "Your father was weak. He was a gentle man in a position that required something harder. He was going to lose the empire to the Eastern Territories within a decade. I did what the empire required." "You believed that?" "I believe it still." Kyle looked at her and thought about the kind of person who could administer a compound to someone slowly dying for 18 months and maintain the conviction that they were acting in service of something larger. He thought about his father, the man before Morwen, a king who had apparently been gentle in ways the empire had classified as weakness, rather than recognizing as the exhaustion of a man trying to govern something that kept demanding more than he had. He thought about what it cost a person to live inside that kind of certainty, the particular deadness required to sustain it. "Arrest her," he said to Sen, who had followed him up the gallery stairs at a distance. Morwen stood as Sen approached. She did it with composure, rising to her feet and straightening her sleeves with the precise, unhurried movement of a woman who intended to control the aesthetic of her own downfall. She looked at Kyle as the guard took her arm. "You will find," she said, "that an empire built on fear is very difficult to dismantle. The stones do not simply become something else because you want them to." "I know," he said. "It will take a long time and I will make mistakes, and some of what she built will hold longer than it should." He held her gaze. "But it will come down, stone by stone, if that is what it takes." She left the gallery in Sen's custody without another word. Her footsteps on the stairs were even and unhurried, the sound of a woman who had decided how she would exit a room and intended to do it with precision to the last. Kyle stood in the empty gallery and breathed. Below him, Seraphine was still at the council table. She had not watched Morwen leave. She was looking at the window, at the afternoon light coming through the high glass, and her hand was flat on the table surface as though she was feeling the stone through the wood, confirming its solidity. He went down to her. They did not speak immediately. They walked out of the council wing together and through the east corridor and out into the palace courtyard, where the execution altar stood in the autumn light, stripped of its ceremony now, just stone steps and a flat top and the shadow it cast across the paving. Seraphine stopped and looked at it for a moment. "I thought about what I would say," she said. "When I was climbing those stairs, I had prepared something about the empire and the bond and why it mattered that it happened in front of everyone." She paused. "And then I got to the top and saw your face, and I could not remember any of it." "What did you say instead?" "I told you I would choose you in every version." She turned to look at him. "I meant it. I also want you to know that it was not a surrender. I was not giving up. I was saying that regardless of what that moment required of us, the choice I made at the beginning was not revoked by any of this." Her eyes were steady, and the directness in them was the thing he had loved first, that refusal to soften what she meant. "That matters to me. The distinction. It matters to me too. Because it means the bond is not a cage. It is not something that happened to me and that I endure because the alternative is worse. She held his gaze. I chose it. I keep choosing it, even when it put me on an altar. He stood with that. Let it settle fully rather than deflecting it into action, which was his oldest habit. He thought about everything the past 5 days had stripped away. The performance of strength he had been maintaining since his wolf first started failing. The decisions made alone that should have been made together. The signature on a proclamation that he had framed as the only move available, and that had been, at least in part, the choice of a man who had been raised to believe that carrying the weight alone was the definition of leading. I have been governing like a man who expects to be left, he said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. I know. Everything I kept from you, the poison, the extent of it, the rate of progression. I kept it because I did not want you to make decisions about your own life based on trying to preserve mine. He exhaled. I told myself it was protection. It was also fear. Fear of what? That if you knew how bad it was, you would spend whatever you had left trying to save me instead of saving yourself. He paused. And that the version of you trying to save a dying man would not be choosing freely anymore. It would be choosing from grief. She looked at him for a long time. The courtyard was quiet around them, the last of the festival cleanup still in progress at the far end, servants moving with the quiet efficiency of people pretending not to observe the Alpha King standing beside an execution altar having a conversation he had needed to have for a long time. You do not get to make that choice for me, she said. Not angry, exact. You do not get to decide what version of my choices is free and what version is compromised. That is mine to determine. A pause. But I understand the fear. I want you to know that I understand it, even while I am telling you that it was wrong. He nodded. That was the accounting he had promised her, and she was giving it to him cleanly and without cruelty, which was how she did everything that mattered. What happens to the compound now, she said. Castor is working with the council physicians to develop a counter-compound. The progression will reverse. Slowly. He glanced down at his hands, still. The tremor had not returned since she opened the bond the previous night. The wolf will take longer. What Morwen damaged in 18 months will not repair in 18 days. No, Seraphine agreed, but it will repair. Yes. She reached out and took his hand. Not the urgent grip of a healer working against a ticking clock, but something quieter, the simple contact of a person who has decided to stay. The weeks that followed were not clean. Clean was a story that empires told about themselves in retrospect, after the surviving version had been polished into something presentable. The reality of dismantling what Morwen had built was closer to excavation than renovation, the slow and often unrewarding work of finding out which structures had been built on false foundations and which were sound enough to keep. Draven resigned from the council and was permitted to do so in exchange for a full accounting of his involvement, which took 3 weeks to document and implicated 6 additional palace staff members and 2 minor territorial administrators. Corvus was found in the lower city 14 days after the review session, having apparently made and then abandoned 3 separate plans to leave the capital. He was brought in without violence and spent the subsequent weeks providing the kind of exhaustive testimony that only emerges from someone who has decided that cooperation is the only remaining asset they have left to spend. The compound's counter-treatment worked as Castor had predicted, slowly and with setbacks, the corruption retreating the way bad things retreat when they have been thoroughly established, in stages rather than all at once. Kael's wolf returned to him incrementally. A week after the review session, it could hold a sustained presence again without flickering. 3 weeks later, it could run through the bond without the contact burning at the edges. 6 weeks later, on a clear morning in early winter when Kael was standing on the north wall of the palace, looking out at the first snow collecting on the capital's rooftops, his wolf rose fully to the surface for the first time in longer than he had a precise count for, and the sensation was not triumphant. It was simpler than that. It was the sensation of something that belonged to him returning to the place it belonged, without ceremony, as though it had never intended to be anywhere else. Seraphine found him on the wall an hour later, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, a heavy cloak over her shoulders that she had clearly grabbed from the nearest available hook rather than the appropriate wardrobe. She looked at his face and knew immediately. She always knew. There it is, she said quietly. There it is. She stood beside him, and they looked out at the snow-covered capital together. Below them, the city moved in its ordinary rhythms, market carts and morning foot traffic, and children chasing each other between the market stalls, with the total abandon of people who had no idea that 5 weeks ago the man standing on the wall above them had nearly died by degrees in his own palace, administered by the woman who had spent 30 years presenting herself as his empire's most devoted servant. The Eastern Territories sent a delegation, Seraphine said. They want to renegotiate the garrison agreements. The language of the request is conciliatory, more than it has been in years. They are testing the new water. Yes, which means they have noticed the change. She paused. The change is real, Kael. The court feels it. The way decisions are made now. The council sessions where people actually argue instead of performing agreement. Rovath told me last week that she has been on this council for 20 years, and this is the first time she has left a session feeling like her vote corresponded to what she actually believed. He absorbed that. It was not a comfortable thing to absorb. The implication that the previous version of his rule had been running on a machinery that produced agreement rather than counsel. He had known it and not known it simultaneously, in the way that rulers know the distortions their power creates and continue operating within them because the alternative requires dismantling something that works even if it works badly. The alternative was what he was doing now. It was harder. It was also, in ways he was still learning to articulate, less exhausting than the performance of certainty had been. Tavern is back in the Northern Territories, Seraphine said. He left 3 days ago. He asked for a field commission with the garrison there. I gave him one. Kael paused. He asked about Aldrich, whether we knew who specifically had carried out the order. I told him we believed it was Corvus, but that we could not be certain. What did he say? He said he was glad Aldrich had not known who was coming, that a man like Aldrich deserved to have the last thing in his mind be something other than betrayal. He was quiet for a moment. I thought that was an accurate thing to say. Seraphine nodded. They stood in the snow for a while longer, not filling the silence, which was a skill that took most people years to develop, and that the two of them had arrived at by necessity in a palace that treated silence as a vacuum to be exploited rather than a space for honest thought. The execution altar was still in the courtyard below. Kael could see it from the wall, its stone surface white now under the accumulated snow, its steps softened by it. He had not ordered it removed. Several people had asked whether he intended to. He intended to repurpose it. Not destroy it, not pretend it had never been there. Turn it into something else. A memorial for Aldrich and the others who had died in the machinery Morwen built. A marker that remembered rather than celebrated, that told the truth about what had stood in that courtyard rather than burying it under new paving stones. He had not announced this yet. He was still working out what exactly the thing should say. He thought it should say something about what happens when power is mistaken for purpose, and he thought it should say something about the specific kind of courage required to stand beside a person who has run out of legal moves and trust that they will find an illegal one worth making. He had not found the right words yet. He would find them. Come inside, Seraphine said. You have been out here long enough, and I need you to look at the delegation correspondence before the afternoon. In a moment, she looked at him, reading whatever she found. Take your moment, she said, and walk back toward the inner door without rushing him, which was Seraphine the way she had always been, granting him the space she would not allow him to deny himself. He stayed on the wall for another few minutes. His wolf settled in his chest, warm and present, the bond running quiet between him and the woman now moving through the corridor below. He thought about what Morwen had said in the gallery, that an empire built on fear was hard to dismantle, that the stones did not simply become something else. She had been right that it was hard. She had been wrong about what determined the character of the stones. Stone did not decide its nature. The hands that shaped it did, the purpose it was given, the things it was asked to hold. He had spent his whole life inside the empire his predecessors had built, accepting its architecture the way you accept the walls of a room you were born in, as though they were the only possible arrangement of the available material. It had taken a poison he could not name, and a council that moved against him and a mate standing on an altar before an empire she had never asked to perform for to make him understand that accepting architecture was not the same as endorsing it. He was not his father. He was not the monster his stepmother had tried to construct from the wreckage of his father's court. He was not the flawless and feared alpha king the territories thought they needed. He was the man who had stood in a doorway and made a terrible decision and then spent 5 days undoing it. He was the man whose hands had shaken for 18 months and who had hidden the shaking because he did not yet understand that what you cannot show to the people you govern, you have already surrendered to the people trying to destroy you. He understood it now. He left the wall. He walked inside. He went to find Seraphine and the delegation correspondence and the ordinary work of a morning in a palace that was still learning, stone by stone, what it meant to be something other than afraid.